Number 18 asks us to graph this graph. Notice it's nice, it's between 0 and 2 pi, and it wants you to do all these things, so you've got to do them. Classify the curve, determine if the graph is symmetric to the origin polar axis or theta equals pi over 2, find the values of theta where r is 0, find the zeros, find the maximum r values and where they occur, and then sketch the graph. So we've got a lot to do. So the first thing we'll do is we'll say what it is. Okay, this is a rose, right? And it's got an even number, so it's got double that, so double 2, so it has 4 petals. Okay, so that's the kind. Now the symmetry. I'm going to leave it blank while I figure it out over here. Okay, so symmetry is over here. The first thing I'm going to check is it symmetric to theta equals pi over 2. And it's a cosine, so if I put in negative r, negative theta, it won't work, but I have to check the b part, which is r pi minus theta. So when I do that, I get 6, r equals 6, and then cosine pi, 2 pi cosine 2 theta plus sine 2 pi sine 2 theta, which I know is 0. So I got r equals 6, cosine of 2 pi is 1, so I have cosine 2 theta plus 0. So r equals 6 cosine 2 theta when I use r and pi minus theta. So theta equals pi over 2 is one of the symmetries. Let's see if it has any other ones. Okay, so let's go to the polar axis. And I can figure out pretty easy, if I put in r negative theta, I'm totally going to have the same thing, right? Because r equals 6 cosine negative 2 theta, which using our identity we know 6 cosine 2 theta. So bingo, that is a yes. So polar axis. And I bet the pole works too. So, which is so nice when you graph. So we got the pole, let's see. We have to check. Now if I put in negative r, I'm not going to get it. Negative r positive theta. That was the first part A of that. But then the second part is r and then pi plus theta. So when I go to r, I get 6 and then cosine 2 pi cosine 2 theta. And then I'll have minus 0 with that sine stuff. So I know r equals 6 cosine 2 theta, because cosine of 2 pi is 1. So it is symmetric to all three. That means I only have to graph the first quadrant to get every point. And I'm going to show you, you don't need your calculator for this one. Okay? So we have the symmetry and we have the kind, and now it wants us to find the values of theta where r is 0, so we will do the zeros next. So zeros, I'll just put it over here while we figure it out. So we would say 0 equals 6 cosine of 2 theta. So cosine of 2 theta equals 0. So where does cosine equal 0? At pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. And we have to go out, we're at 2, we have a double angle, so we have to go out to 4 pi. So 2 theta will equal pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, and then you'll come around for pi over 2, so you'll do another 2 pi, so that would be 4 pi over 2, or plus pi over 2, so that's 5 pi over 2, and add 2 pi now to 3 pi over 2, which is 7 pi over 2. Okay, and I can't go any further because I can only go to 7 pi over 2 is almost 4 pi. So that was 2 theta, so now divide by 2. So theta is pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, and 7 pi over 4. Okay, so those are my zeros. So I'm going to put it up here. Zeros are theta equals pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, and 7 pi over 4. Now, when I do my XY chart, I can put a 0 at every one of those places. Okay, so I only have, the only one in the first quadrant is pi over 4, but at any rate, I'm okay. Now, the last thing you have to do is figure out what R is. So the absolute value of R is equal to what at theta equals what? This is good to learn how to write all this out, because this is the information you're going to be graded on as long as, and then of course your graph. So all this is important to do. So let me do that down here. That's the value of R would be 6 times the cosine of 2 theta has to be 1. So I'll do times 1, which equals absolute value of 6. And then R would be 6 times negative 1, which is negative 6. So sometimes it's going to be 6 and sometimes it's going to be negative 6. So we know that it's equal to 6. The absolute value of R has to equal to 6. So now theta, you would, to find where it is, you put 6 in for R. So 6 equals 6 cosine 2 theta. So 1 equals cosine of 2 theta. So where does cosine equal 1? Cosine equals 1 at 0. And now we also have, well, we have to keep going, but I'm actually going to skip, not ask that question yet. I want to do the other one. We also have negative 6 equals 6 cosine 2 theta. So cosine 2 theta equals negative 1. So we're looking where theta equals where cosine equals plus or minus 1. So cosine equals 1 at 0, so 2 theta is equal to 0, and at pi, and then again at 2 pi, and then again at 3 pi. That's because we have a double angle. We have to go out to before 4 pi. So then theta would be 0 over 2 or 0, pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, which is pi, and 3 pi over 2. So those angles would be 0, pi over 2, pi, and 3 pi over 2. Okay, we're getting there. Now we just have to graph it. So we're going to make a theta R chart. I'm going to come up a little higher. Theta and R. And I have a lot of these points already figured out. At 0, that was one of my maximums, right? Right here. And by the way, this is a positive 6, then it's negative 6, and then positive 6 and negative 6, right? Based on how we were doing it. So at 0, it's 6. So now I'm going to use this green line. I have symmetry here, and across the pole too. So when I plot a point, I can go on the other side also. So the first thing I'm going to do is plot 0, 6. Oh, that's way too big. Sorry. So 0, 6. And that means it has to be at pi 6. Okay, and we can see that. These are the two positive ones, right? At pi over 2, we can go ahead and graph that if you want. At pi over 2, it's negative 6. So here's pi over 2 up here, and so negative 6 would be down here. But then that means 3 pi over 2, it's negative 6, which means it's up here. So I have those 4 corners, and I got that all from these R's. Okay, so the next, I'm not going to do pi over 12, I'll do pi over 6. And at pi over 6, I think this is going to come out nice because it's 2 theta. It's 6 times cosine of 2 pi over 6, which is cosine of pi over 3. Cosine pi over 3 is a half. So 6 times 1/2 is equal to 3. So at pi over 6, I'm equal to 3. So I'm right here. Now I'm going to get 4 other points off of that, because if I reflect it over the polar axis, I'm at 11 pi over 6. And then if I reflect it over theta equals pi over 2, I'm at 5 pi over 6. And then 7 pi over 6. So I got 4 points out of that guy. So then I'm going to do pi over 4. And at pi over 4, if you remember, pi over 4, where's my pi over 4? Was a 0. So I'm back down to 0 at pi over 4, which means that I can tell I have right there a petal and another petal. So now I'm going to go to pi over 3. This, again, didn't need my calculator. Love it. So this would be 6 times cosine of 2 pi over 3, which is -3. So at pi over 3, here's pi over 3 up here, I go -3, which is right here. And that's going to give me 4 more points. Okay, across this axis, it's going to go to 5 pi over 3. Then across the polar axis, it's going to go to pi over 3. Across the theta equals pi over 2, it's going to go to 2 pi over 3. And then at pi over 2, that's another one of my zeros. So you can see I have another petal here and another petal here, and I was supposed to have a 4-petal rose. So I've graphed it without a calculator and all that work. Now yes, you do need to know how to do this. All of this work. You're only going to have to do one, but you're going to have to do it. Okay, so try this again with other problems.